Right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the third webinar of the IEA Kenya's third webinar for the year. My name is Kwame Wino. I work at the Institute of Economic Affairs. And on behalf, I welcome you to our webinar today, and I'm thankful for your taking time this morning to be here. Now, everybody knows that Kenya has a debt problem. I mean, it's described variously, but at least everybody knows that Kenya and the country in general is facing some kind of a problem related to debt. We describe it variously. Some of us think it's volumes. Some people think it's who is owed. And some people think it's the terms of those loans. But from 1st of April last year, the government of Kenya entered into a program with the IMF. This was a 38-month program, and the function of this program is to help the government of Kenya finances and to restore a balance in public finances, reducing the deficits, but at the same time being able to manage its finances over the medium term. So this is a 38-month program. It comes with some structural requirements and changes. Yes, what Kenyans call structural adjustments, but at the same time, it also comes with help and about $2.3 billion to be dispersed over the time period. And remember, this money is dispersed based on the attainment of certain benchmarks. The Institute of Economic Affairs, therefore, has a one-year program starting in January, and our interest here is actually to track government's commitment, the government of Kenya's commitments in terms of this arrangement. So the arrangement comes in the form that the government of Kenya makes an undertaking on behalf of the Republic to the IMF to execute certain changes, but at the same time to receive assistance to help with that. So at our program in the IEA on popular economics, special programs on popular economics, we have taken it as a responsibility and part of the request from the members of the IEA to track and to actually report on a regular basis to track Kenya's commitments, but also to ask ourselves and to create public education and discussions around the performance of the government around this program. So we know that the second report was issued in December. It's marked the 2nd of December, but I think the Kenyan media reported on it on the 21st. And so what we're trying to do today is to go through Kenya's milestones, which are the commitments by the report, and to understand what has happened and to see how the progress of the entire 38-month arrangement is going in. Being as it is right now that it's almost 8 months gone into the program, 9 months gone into the program, and obviously almost 1/4 of it or thereabouts has been completed. So what we'll do today is my two colleagues, Anna Grace and Maureen, will take us through the milestones. They'll synthesize the report that was presented and isolate a few things that we think are essential for the public to discuss, and then we'll make some conclusions on that. But just before we go that, we received some questions around the lending and the funding. And one of the things that we see as we review Kenya's media and some of the questions that we receive is that we might have to actually say what kind of institution is the IMF and what kind of financing or loans, as many of us say, are provided to its member states. So first, it should be clear that one, the reason Kenya is in this compact program with the IMF is because Kenya is a member, and those facilities for lending are useful for members because the history of the IMF, it was formed to manage, or rather to help countries to manage the risks that come from balance of payments problems between countries, in the sense that they tend to have ripple effects, and a country problem may look like a problem in a domestic setting, but it actually ripples off. Why? Because countries receive and give payments to one another. So huge fluctuations in those could actually cause risks for not just collapse, but for difficulty and even recessions. So this presentation has, it's in 4 areas. So first will be a background and introduction which I'll give. And then my two colleagues will go into the program milestones. And then, of course, the debt sustainability analysis, which is very, very important. And then we'll make some conclusions. So let me just start by the background and the introduction. And as you can see, we have a table. Kenya's lending program, which was basically released as part of the letter of intent in 1st of February last year, 1st of April 2021, is under so while the whole program is 2.3 billion US dollars, the IMF has different institutions, if we may call them, or different facilities under which funding is provided. So Kenya's funding comes under two facilities. There's the extended fund facility and the extended credit facilities. All of them have different functions and are disbursed in different ways. So what we are trying to do here is to first create help, or rather to distinguish for ourselves, and hope it is useful for other people as well, what kind of facility is each, because they're not necessarily, and they should not be interchanged. So part of the 2.3 billion is provided under the extended fund facility, and a portion of it is under the extended credit facility. So the extended fund facility, the overall purpose, as I stated, of lending and partnership between the IMF and governments is to settle balance of payments, to help countries or sovereign members that are facing balance of payments problems. And balance of payments problems come from the fact that there might be a microeconomic problem or a difficulty makes a country unable to find sufficient foreign exchange to support its trade, to buy inputs from foreign places, and actually to also make its payments that are due. Partly because obviously foreign currency is part of how international trade happens, but also how countries exchange payments. So to stabilize that system, the IMF comes in as a way of helping countries to manage such shocks. It therefore has two facilities that are relevant to Kenya today. It's the extended fund facility and the extended credit facility. All have different purposes. I mean, broad global purpose, but they are fashioned for different problems. They have different eligibility, duration, the access, obviously the conditions that apply, which many people call conditionalities, and the lending terms. So let me start with the extended fund facility, which is on this middle column. Its purpose is just basically to restore a country facing balance of payments imbalance due to structural impediments or slow growth. So when slow growth takes place, obviously, countries might have a problem with managing the balance of payments problems. And then, of course, it also provides support for comprehensive programs, including policies to construct structural imbalances for an extended period, to correct structural imbalances for an extended period. So this is the extended fund facility. It deals with the same problem of balance of payments, but the causes of balance of payments are different. And so here it is, extended fund facility coming in to help countries to do that. So as you can tell, it has a structural change component. And the reason it has a structural change component is because it is applicable when the source of the problem or the source of balance of payments problems is structural within the economy itself. So it means that a country needs some facility or some funding which enables it to actually tide that problem, but also initiate changes in the structure of its economy that repairs that macroeconomic imbalance that may have caused that balance of payments. So inherent in these extended fund facilities, therefore, a structural change component. So you can call them conditionalities, you can call them structural adjustments, whatever it is you call them, the language means that the function of the loan is actually to create those structural changes. So eligibility, of course, comes to countries are eligible when they are facing medium to long-term balance of payment problems. So that's a medium to long-term balance of payments problems. As you can see, it's because of either slow growth or something in the economy that's not generating sufficient activity in the economy to allow for structural change, for balance of payments to be maintained. So a country is eligible, and remember, countries apply. You say, look, we are facing this structural problem because of either slow growth or because of burden of our debts or because of this. We therefore need something to tide us. Therefore, a medium to long-term problem. So it's focusing on medium to long-term change as well. So these loans are not given as an end itself. They're meant to actually create structural change based on their members. The duration, the typical duration is 3 to 4 years because it's a medium-term thing. Access, there are two parts to access. There's a normal access based on the fact that every country at the IMF, every country based on the size of its economy that is a member then becomes eligible for certain number of, or a quota, has a quota based on the size of its economy. So for instance, if Kenya has, based on the economy, the quota of funds that would be available under the extended fund facility would be a ratio or to Kenya's economic size, relative to the global size. So that will be available. It doesn't mean the entire amount of money would be applied for, but a country can actually apply for that, depending on what is considered the necessary amount, but obviously there's a cap because of the quota. However, in exceptional circumstances, where a country's system has increased challenges or challenges are much bigger and deeper, then there are also exceptional access, where exceptional access means while a quota exists for a country, such as Kenya, say, for instance, relative to the size of the economy, a country can actually apply for a greater amount based on the fact that the exceptional circumstances and therefore exceptional access is required. So there'd be an application to the executive board, which would then make a decision based on what those exceptional circumstances are. Remember, this is to deal with risks and to deal with a crisis or a problem or a challenge. So what's the conditionality? The strong conditionality for extended fund facility is basically a strong focus on structural reforms to address the institutional or economic weaknesses that have been identified. So remember, country applies, says this is what our weakness is, this is what is causing it. If that cause is properly agreed upon, then it means that part of this funding must create that structural change. So the conditionality is that there must be a strong focus, and part of those funds that are made available must be used to reform. So for instance, in Kenya's case, if part of the problems is that we have state-owned enterprises, and my colleagues will mention that, then it means that part of the funding will occur, or rather will be given. And among the things that will be monitored is the extent to which state-owned enterprises, right, or parastatals as we call them, are being restructured in order to solve the problem that was identified in the first place. So yes, it's an economic repair problem, macroeconomic repair problem. So necessarily must come with a structural change component, because if lending is given and it does not solve the problem that has led to the question, to the weakness or the challenge, then obviously it's in vain. So when we talk about conditionality, regardless of what your political intent would be, if an extended fund facility is applied for, then it means that a country is admitting to the fact that a structural change is required. And therefore, that conditionality is almost automatic. So what are the lending terms? Well, the amounts are to be paid over 12 equal semi-annual installments. So basically, it's paid twice a year. So whatever the extended facility is, whatever the amount of money is, it's divided based on the duration of the loan, and it's paid in equal amounts every 6 months. So over 12 equal semi-annual components. The duration could go from 4.5 to 10 years. Their commitment fees, remember, because these are structural change components, the commitment fees means once an agreement is signed, money is placed aside for a country to be able to claim or to apply for whenever it needs it, because it's determined by the duration of the contract and the agreement that has been stated. And the way they do that is because, as I said, every country has a quota, which are called the special drawing rights. So there's a special drawing rights interest rate determined by the board, the executive board, and then plus 1%. So there's a benchmark rate, and then 1% or basis points is added. And then there's a service charge of 50 points on amount drawn. So there's a service charge of 50 points for the amount that is drawn. Of course, at the end of the completion, the reason for this is to make it, why a service charge is applied is because it's not supposed to make it easy for countries to borrow. It's supposed to be a last resort. And therefore, these are incentives that are actually supposed, to the extent that is possible, reduce the appetite for borrowing unless it is completely necessary. So this component of funding, or this design of the funding, is, in our view at the Institute of Economic Affairs, essential for Kenyans to understand, because the idea that global institutions exist to simply feed institutions money to create dependency might be considered self-evident, but the design of these loans suggests to us that actually that component of that political argument is extremely weak if we look at the way in which these are. So actually borrowing has costs beyond just the interest rates that apply. So the extent to which interest rates apply suggests that it's supposed to be a cap, or at least provide a governance, a form of rationing, so that all money that is borrowed by a sovereign has to be extremely well regulated, or at least needed, because there are conditions that apply. Of course, at the end of it, because of the commitment fees, they're usually waived if an agreement ends successfully and the commitment fees then become unnecessary, because it's basically supposed to just simply mean that you're committed to actually drawing on the funds when it's available. Extended fund facility. The extended credit facility is another one. It's created under the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, PRGT, which is basically part of the institutions within the IMF itself. And it's aimed at supporting countries to move towards stable and sustainable macroeconomic position and durable poverty reduction. So in Kenya's case, the extended credit facility became necessary, as you'll see later why, because of its terms, because of the shock of COVID. So with the fact that that shock would have created significant problems with poverty reduction and all that, it becomes necessary, as it's stated here, to support macroeconomic position and durable poverty reduction. And it may help to catalyze additional foreign debt, because it helps a country to stabilize its position, especially in a position such as was created by an unforeseen shock such as that was created under the COVID, obviously globally, but also in Kenya's case. So that opens up a channel for borrowing to help with stabilizing and government to respond to the fact that there were shocks. There's a problem to support initiatives that government would like to support that would suffer if the money was not available and would deepen the poverty problem, which is part of Kenya's growth plan. In terms of eligibility, it's available for all PRGT, which is basically Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, eligible in Kenya is, and which are faced with balance of payment problems. So balance of payment problems can also come. So that is the domain of the IMF, the first part of the reason for which it exists. But it also recognizes that countries have a poverty reduction responsibility. So if balance of payments would suffer, and that in turn would be connected to the goals related to poverty reduction, obviously, a country then has this facility. So that eligibility would be there. Kenya becomes eligible under those circumstances. The duration, an initial period of 3 years and up to 5 years. So basically an initial period of 3 years. So it covers the frame. And then obviously there's a possibility for maximum and maybe followed with another ECF after expiry or termination. So an ECF could follow another one, provided the eligibility is maintained and the purpose is justified. In terms of access is basically on a case-by-case, dependent on country circumstances, ability to pay, and obviously past record. So countries, because of the extended credit facility, you'll see it as very easy terms. It's also provided fairly quickly in order to respond to that crisis. But obviously, access is only available based, unlike the extended fund facility, which has normal access and exceptional access. In the case of extended credit facility, access is on a case-by-case basis, but it's dependent on country circumstances, which justifies it, ability to pay, and obviously a past record and how a country has performed using the facility in the past. The conditionality is that the recipient undertakes a program towards stable and sustainable macro position in the medium term, based on what the shock would be. So, for instance, in Kenya's case, it would be what the effects have been coming from COVID. It contains quantitative conditions and structural benchmarks. So there are also structural benchmarks to it. And obviously, program reviews by board are done every 6 months. So obviously, these are part of the conditionalities. A review is done every 6 months to see whether the country is in. So this is shared with the same conditionality for both the EFF and the extended credit facility. So it's a recipient that takes program towards stable and sustainable macro position in the medium term. It contains qualitative and structural benchmarks. So there are structural benchmarks on it as well. And the program reviews by board are undertaken. So obviously structural benchmarks here too. Part of the reason the shock is here, program is depleting. I mean, program is country finances are suffering. Then obviously there are structural benchmarks to strengthen whether it's existing facilities or to create further change. So remember, in both these cases, you can see that the extended credit facility for different circumstances, different conditions apply, but they must create a change, because part of the reason is the reason a country goes to borrowed these funds is to repair internally some some weaknesses which have created an imbalance in the economy. So they must have a repair effect. It's not to borrow because a facility is available. In terms of the lending terms, for extended credit facility, we've talked about why the reason for its existence, on its justification, 0 interest rates with a grace period of 5.5 years. So a country that qualifies and has applied has 0 interest rates. So here it is receiving funding, very little interest rates, 0 interest rates, but it's available for 5.5 years and a maturity period of 10 years. So obviously within 10 years, the whole loan must be paid, but it has 0 interest rate. Now, this part of this distinction is important for us as an Institute of Economic Affairs because it has, one, public education. It's a public education interest or contribution, but also more importantly, so that we understand under what circumstances the partnership or the program under which Kenya and the IMF are engaged right now are going through. So you can tell that this maturity, the question of the maturity, the question of the extended credit facility, but also the question about what structural problems are being fixed, come from what the diagnosis of the problem is to justify why one loan or the other should go in. Yep. So now I allow my colleagues to go to the presentation, talking about what the program milestones are, and then yes, so Maureen, welcome.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Maureen from the Institute of Economic Affairs, and I'll be taking you through the Kenya-IMF program milestones. We are tracking milestones from the first report that we did, the report that came out in April 2021. We have a total of 5 program milestones that have been achieved. The first one will be all quantitative performance criteria and indicative targets were met. That was in late June. The quantitative performance criteria, this includes the specific measurable conditions for the IMF in lending that always relate to the macroeconomic variables under the control of the authorities, and this include the fiscal balances, the international reserves, the external borrowing, and the monetary and credit aggregates. For the indicative targets, they may be set for quantitative indicators to assess progress in a program's objectives. They include priority spending for transfers to vulnerable groups, that is the women, children, and people with disabilities, free primary and secondary education, food programs, health coverage and insurance, and vaccination and immunization programs. And from the report, the IMF says that the performance was robust despite the challenging environment, and these quantitative performance criteria and indicative targets were met comfortably with primary deficit performance criteria, which they had a target of 508 billion Kenyan shillings, but they managed to achieve 455 billion. Moving on, we have inflation remained within the target range of 2.5 to 7.5%. We see that this is a wide range, and the target is wide or rather it's a safe target. This was achieved despite the effects of higher fuel and food prices. On the next milestone, we're looking at financial evaluation. August, Kenya Airways is among the 9 state-owned enterprises that were supposed to be evaluated. In the first report, the evaluations are supposed to be done by the end of March. In this report, the Kenya Airways financial evaluations are completed towards the end of August, and in the evaluations were meant to restructure KQ, Kenya Airways that is, and anticipate providing significant financial support over the medium term. and also fundamental restructuring of the business model, given the challenges that have been there, as downsizing, renegotiation and contracts, among others. Okay, on the next section, we're going to look at the structural benchmarks that have been achieved towards the end of June. There were 3, and 2 were implemented with delay, and 1 is still pending. The 2 that were implemented were the strategy to strengthen and modernize the monetary policy framework published by CBK, that was towards the end of July. Under this strategy to strengthen and modernize the monetary policy framework published by the CBK, they're looking to diversify and refine its macroeconomic model, macroeconomic and forecasting frameworks, and improve the data collection, as well as address the competitive challenges of some of the small banks. They also have to strengthen banks' assessment of climate-related risk, where the CBK is playing a regulatory role of making sure that these banks incorporate the climate-related risk in their strategy. Moving on, we have the implementation of a common payroll system across the MDAs and counties. Of an agreed road. Sorry about that. The slides. Okay, sorry about that. We were looking at the implementation of a common. We were looking at the strategy to strengthen and modernize monetary policy framework published by CBK. This was implemented in July 2021. It was looking to diversify and refine its macroeconomic modeling and forecasting frameworks to improve the data collection, to address the competitive challenge of some of the small banks, where it's looking to strengthen its acquisition and mergers, and also to strengthen banks' assessment of climate-related risk, where the CBK is playing a regulatory role of making sure banks incorporate the climate-related risk in their strategy and governance. Moving on, the implementation of a common payroll system across MDAs and counties. This was implemented by articulation towards late October of an agreed roadmap to implement the payroll system by June 2022. That's a new target for June 2022. There's also the beneficial ownership. This one was not implemented, has not yet reflected on the public procurement portal due to privacy and data issues by these beneficial owners, but the authorities are working on it to require consent from the beneficial owners to publish beneficial ownership information in the portal for all awarded contracts, and this is a new benchmark for March 2022. Moving on, we have the launch of annual tax expenditures. This was reported the report was done in September 2021. This report includes the tax exemptions, among other things. Then we have the separate reports issued on fiscal risk from the PPPs and the state-owned enterprises, and this was implemented with delay. It was expected to be implemented towards September, but it was implemented towards the end of December. We're looking at the milestones, the structural benchmarks that were supposed to be implemented between September to December. We have the launch of annual tax expenditures, which was implemented in September. The report was published in September. Then we have the separate reports on fiscal risk of the PPPs and state-owned enterprises, with the plan to feed into the forthcoming budget process. The function won't feed into the budget process, given that the process was delayed. Then we have the tax audits on funds in sectors with large compliance gaps using risk-based approaches has been met well before the target dates. Yeah, thank you.
I'll take you through the debt sustainability analysis section. So this debt sustainability analysis is an analytical assessment of Kenya's medium-term to long-term risks within its debt portfolio. This document is a report on its own, usually issued once about every 2 years. And in this case, it was attached to the same document my two colleagues have gone ahead of me, have broken down for you, but it's in a later stage of the document, but a different report entirely. Maybe if you had the opportunity to go through the April country reports by the IMF on Kenya, you would not find this DSA section. So this is a new addition, and just to emphasize, it's a whole report on its own. So it's called the Debt Sustainability Analysis, which we'll refer to from here on as the DSA. So the DSA covers a scope of like 8 sections, beginning with public debt coverage. So this is basically just what it's defining what public debt is and what do they consider when they're doing this debt sustainability analysis. The background on debt, underlying assumptions, which we'll describe in detail in later slides, the country classification and determination of scenario stress test. So this scenario stress test, my colleague Maureen has just spoken about some relief within the fund, the EFF and the ECF, that was specifically designated to saving failing SOEs. In April, they identified 18 state-owned enterprises that posed the highest risk to, Kenya's exchequer, like they were running on losses. There were universities, there was KQ, and a number of other state-owned enterprises. As it stands right now, KQ has already been allocated some of its funds. You'd read further in detail in the report. And among these 18 state-owned enterprises, this scenario stress test reveals that they need a relief of about 105 billion Kenya shillings. So that's basically what that section discusses, the scenario stress test on the state-owned enterprises, the public-private partnerships, and just other public debt, guaranteed public debt by the government of Kenya. The next section under the debt sustainability analysis is external debt sustainability analysis, which is very important because when unpacking Kenya's debt portfolio, you really need to segregate what's external, what's domestic, because they have two very different characteristics. External debt, as we'll discuss later, is usually more expensive with a heavy reliance on like commercial debt. They have higher interest rates. It being external in and of itself contains that foreign exchange risk because the money is coming in dollars or other foreign currencies. And by the time we're paying, there's going to be a fluctuation between the Kenya shilling and that foreign currency. So that's a risk on its own. Also, just in total public debt sustainability analysis. Second from last is risk rating and vulnerabilities. And the last part, which is the authorities' views. will cover. So we won't go in detail in for all of them, but we'll stress what we think was really outstanding for us in this report while looking at Kenya's public debt. So the first part is public debt coverage. This is basically, again, just the scope of public debt. What does this debt sustainability analysis consider as public debt? And to begin with, it considers the central government debt. So this is debt that the government has taken, the central government, not the devolved governments, the 47 counties. It does not include, it excludes county government debt, and they call this legacy debt of the pre-devolved county governments. This is before devolution, right? And then it also considers Social Security Fund, which is number 4 on the first part of this table. It also considers the central bank debt borrowed on behalf of the government of Kenya, and at the same time, government guaranteed debt. So those 4 types of, those 4 categories of subsectors of the public debt are what the debt sustainability analysis considers. It does not consider an unguaranteed state-owned enterprise debt, which is 0.8 over here. What else does it not consider? The extra budgetary funds and state and local government debt and other elements in the general government. So yeah, that's this. When we talk about debt sustainability analysis, that's what we're describing. So from here onwards, we're just looking at those 4. The next part is on the background of Kenya's public debt. Here, this table 2, text table 2, is giving a decomposition of Kenya's public debt and debt service by creditor. So the creditors can be split either externally or domestic, with external creditors being multilateral institutions like the IMF and World Bank, Africa Development Bank, bilateral creditors such as the Exim China Bank, and commercial creditors. So I'd like us to take a note of the third column, which is the debt stock end of period 2020, % of total debt. So Kenya's total debt stock is 100%, right? External debt end of period 2020 stood at 51.9%, with domestic debt at 48.1%. Already you can see that the arrow is leaning on external debt. So Kenya has a, I don't want to say heavy reliance, but a strong appetite for external debt. And like I said before, external debt, with the exception of debt from multilateral creditors, which is usually concessional debt, debt loans are usually loans that are very favorable. You know, you'd find even interest rates of 0%, like Kwame mentioned, in the extended credit facility fund. That, like, it's basically just free money. You pay me when you have the ability to pay at no interest rates. That's what we call concessional loans. They're very favorable loans. With the exception of multilateral creditors, bilateral creditors, commercial creditors are usually very, very expensive. Most of the times, these loans come in foreign currency. Key, that's very key, foreign currency, and the interest rates are very high. You combine those 2 and you're stuck in the mud in debt distress. So what the authorities, which IMF staff refer to as authorities, these are the Kenya government authorities, they say their strategy is to move towards, you know, concessional loans, moving away from this bilateral and commercial creditors, while also just trying to, you know, roll over the outstanding Eurobonds. So rollover is just to like extend the period of payments and to lengthen, which brings us to our next slide, the tenure of debt. So tenure is very important. When you're talking about debt, you're looking at first the amount you're borrowing, which is like the principal amount, the interest rate, which will determine your interest amount, and then the tenure, which is the time that this debt takes to mature. You have a short tenure, you're going to have trouble paying that debt because you're like really, you're tiptoeing and running to meet your debt obligations in a very short period of time. But if you extend your tenure, it allows you to, ease out, like you're trying to pace yourself through this period. And for the Kenyan government, it's very, I think it would make sound judgment to procure or to acquire to acquire debt that is longer term, which will give them the allowance to, invest the money they've borrowed in activities, in projects that will actually generate substantial revenues that will go back to paying this debt. Like I mentioned, the interest, So on top of the principal, you have to pay something on top of that principal amount when you're paying your debt. And that's why concessional loans are very important, because they are very favorable. Like the interest rates are either very low or they're not even there at all. And you can see between the period 2014, 2015, yes, the tenures were going down, which means Kenya was, in terms of domestic debt, it was really going for short-term domestic debt. And domestic debt in Kenya is in the form of treasury bills and treasury bonds. Treasury bills are usually referred to as T-bills. So they'd go for, once the 91 days, instead of going for like 10-year, 5-year bonds. Within 2016 and 2019, it almost stayed the same at about like 6-year, 10-year bonds and bills. But then moving up from 2018-19 to where we are right now, they're trying to extend that tenure by about like 3 years. So I think that's a good effort by the government, and it's going across all securities. So not just bonds, even bills. And we're talking about domestic debt. So the bit about domestic debt, most of the time, it doesn't have that foreign exchange risk involved. So it's a bit less riskier. Yeah. Then the next section we highlight is the underlying assumptions. So under underlying assumptions, the first point to note is that Kenya's fiscal deficit reached a 3-year high in the financial year 2020-2021, and it was at 8.2% of GDP. We all know why this happened, because of the COVID shock, and we're all blaming everything on COVID, but in reality, it was a health crisis that affected our economy, and the Kenya's authorities project that the fiscal deficit will reduce in subsequent years to about, I think they range it at like, okay, definitely lower than 8%. It goes to about 5% at some point. Yeah, so between 2022, in 2023, they projected to be at like 5.8% of GDP, all the way to 2026, a very optimistic target of 2.7% of GDP. Again, this would require fiscal consolidation, something that this Kenya-IMF program really emphasizes on, trying to reduce our expenditure, government expenditure, to bring it closer to the revenue government is collecting. So to narrow that gap between expenditure and revenue, that's what we call the fiscal deficit. Then the next point is that the government strategy moving forward, like I mentioned, is to reduce the reliance on external commercial borrowing and increase its reliance on concessional development financing, again, from institutions like the World Bank, the IMF. And this really helped just like get the country back on its feet, and in total, like improve its debt profile. So it's a strategy that's rolling. As you can see, they're making efforts, but it will only, or I think it matters more if we also control our spending while meeting our revenue targets, because we'll still need to borrow. It's not bad to borrow as long as you're able to meet your debt obligations, which we'll talk about in the final slide when we talk about sustainability. Another underlying assumption under this report is that the G20 DSSI that happened last year, 2021, which is the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, has lowered Kenya's external financing needs by about $514 million, which is a huge amount. So it happened in two bits. In the first quarter, in the first half of the year, it was about $425 million USD and 89 million in the next half. So this debt suspension does not really mean they've written off your debt, but it's just like extending the terms of the loan initially acquired to allow you to be able to meet your payments. Yeah. Then another very, very important underlying assumption, which is point 11 of this debt sustainability analysis, is the split of the amount Kenya received in August 2021 that was part of this 38-month agreement. So in August 2021, Kenya received $740 million. So like it was mentioned in the earlier slides, this 38-month agreement, which we also really went into detail last year, the money is not given all at once. It's about $3 billion, 3 point something billion. It's not all given at once. So once you achieve your structural benchmarks, then some money is released in tranches. And in August 2021, Kenya received 740 million. Now the strategy is for half of this amount, 50%, to be retained in reserves at the central bank. So reserves are in foreign currency, right? And then the other half is to go to the government of Kenya, which is now known as on lent. So when you say on lent by the Central Bank of Kenya to the government, it means the money is now being lent to a third party, which is the government of Kenya. So you see the money moved from IMF to CBK, and it will later on move to the government of Kenya. And as it moves to the government of Kenya, this will last for 30 years. So let me just read this part I've highlighted, the 3 lines I've highlighted in green. So half of the allocation, which is $370 million, is on lent by the Central Bank of Kenya to the government in the form of 30-year domestic claim with a bullet maturity. Let me stop there. So bullet maturity means that at the end of those 30 years, it's going to be a lump sum payment, of both the principal, the interest, which really is like saying we've given Kenya $370 million with a grace period of 29 years. That's amazing. So this is what I'm saying. These are concessional loans. They're very favorable conditions. In terms of the loans are very favorable to the borrower. And yeah, Kenya has been given 30 years to pay back the 370 million, carrying an interest rate equal to the Kenya shilling equivalent of the average special drawing rights, SDR rate. So this is a rate that's calculated by the IMF based on some, they call them basket currencies like the USD, the Euro, the Sterling Pound, and the Chinese Yuan. That's Chinese currency. Yeah, they calculate a certain rate and it's revised on a daily basis every working day at the IMF. And then that's now what's going to be the interest rate for Kenya upon reaching the time at maturity. So in Kenya shilling equivalent, this 50% is going to be like about 41.4 billion shillings available to the government of Kenya for the period of 30 years, which is from last year up till 2051. So that's a very important point. Now we've come to the end of the presentation, which is just to sum up all this debt sustainability analysis, which is the staff's views, and we term this as our conclusions. And the staff in this case, like I said, the DSA is conducted it's carried out every 1 in 2 years, and it's done in collaboration with the IMF and the World Bank. So the two did the debt sustainability analysis on Kenya's debt portfolio, and they came up with the 4 findings. So in terms of risk of external debt distress, Kenya has a high risk of external debt distress, which is very obvious because of our appetite for external and very commercial loans, which, just to emphasize, it's something that should be on our fingertips now. the foreign exchange risk involved, high interest rates, and usually the short tenure of that debt, and which in turn affects the overall risk of debt distress. And overall here we are considering both external and domestic debt in Kenya. Kenya has a high overall risk of external debt distress. And then when we speak of granularity in the risk rating, granularity refers to looking, the granular rating is carrying out a risk assessment of Kenya's individual loans within its portfolio. So the portfolio is a basket, but then you have different loans. You have some from Exim, you have some from Africa Development Bank, the IMF, which are like two, the extended credit facility, extended fund facility with two very different conditions. One doesn't even charge an interest rate. The other one is the SDR with 100 basis points on top of that. So when you look at all these loans in Kenya's basket of loans, they pose different risks in terms of the interest rates, the tenures, just everything about these loans is different. And when you look at them together, now that's what you call a granular risk rating. And the IMF and World Bank found that Kenya's granular rating is sustainable. Sustainable means that Kenya will be able to meet its debt obligations without defaults or without exceptional assistance. And finally, the application of judgment is whether or not to continue with this facility, and they found that there is no need to discontinue this facility. So the facility will continue because Kenya's debt is sustainable, despite it having high debt distress in terms of external and overall risk. So that's the end of our presentation. Thank you very much.
All right. So to summarize, thanks, Maureen and Anna Grace. So what my colleagues did was first to take us through. I mean, we started with a distinction to actually try some kind of literacy around the kind of loans that the IMF provides, or the facilities through which the partnerships are made. So on the one side is the extended credit facility and the extended funds facility. So that's the first part. And then the second part, we went into the milestones as covered in the report that came out in mid December last year, highlighting some of the achievements. Obviously, the general tenor of the report is that Kenya achieved, or the authorities, as they call it, achieved most of the benchmarks that were there, even if we know that the state-owned corporations, there were reports that were taken out. Those reports are supposed to guide the formation of new rules. The main area in which, of course, there was a significant challenge is on the rules on beneficial ownership, and to track questions on beneficial ownership among companies, especially in public procurement, to the portal, so that there is a direct link between who's receiving money and who's really the company behind public procurement, and obviously for which there's a huge corruption risk. So that was delayed. I think the benchmark has been moved forward, but we all understand why that would be a problem, and that's what concerns us about the program, is that some of these things might not just be politically risky, but it's showing that the government of Kenya, despite its best efforts, is still reluctant, or at least is not as agile in accomplishing some of the structural benchmarks or the milestones as others. And there's a very clear pattern that all those that deal with the ability to change and to increase disclosures would present significant political risks for some people. So I think it's an area in which we at the IEA and all other actors in Kenya need to focus a little bit more on, force discussions in Parliament, but at the same time, the pressure of the media for the coverage about beneficial ownership, because the beneficial ownership register in Kenya is long overdue. I think it's prudent business practice. So the claims about privacy and all that, in our view, are not entirely convincing, given that if a person is transacting operations with the Kenyan state and receiving money on behalf of the public, I think there's an extent to which who is receiving that money should be clear. in terms of the beneficial ownership, or at least the details of that. So the idea that that is a violation of privacy is one that I think they should be pushed back on. And then the final part was, while we spoke about the fact here is to actually track the milestones, but it's also important for us to then track. We then go into the third part of our presentation, which is the debt sustainability analysis. And here it's an analysis carried out every 3 years, 2 or 3 years, by the IMF and the IDA, the branch of the World Bank, International Development Agency of the World Bank, and they carry out these for countries on a 2-3 year rolling basis. It talks about the public health coverage, public debt coverage, and its function is actually to understand what risks in the medium term countries faced with respect to responding to debt payments that may come, and obviously what the macroeconomic effects of that would be. My colleague has taken us through that, the underlying assumptions, but I think 2 things are most clear. One of them is that if you look at slide 13, Kenya's domestic debt average time to maturity, between 2014 to 2017, the average maturity of Kenyan debt really dropped, suggesting that Kenya's debt was becoming more, as a matter of fact, more risky. If you look at slide 13, yes, here. So as you can tell you is that between 2013, all the blue line tells us that the average debt, all securities, was actually falling, well, a little bit flat. And then it started to rise in 2017. And the reason it started to rise in 2017 is because at that time, the debt distress became clear, and government then made the policy and started to implement it of stretching the tenure of debts. And part of stretching the tenure of debts, it's not too high, but it's still at about 6 or 7 years in terms of that, suggesting that debts, there'll be more time and less distress, basically, in terms of that payment. So the policy is telling us that it's going in the right place. But if you can tell about bonds, there's also been a sharp uptick from 2018 in terms of bonds. Obviously, bonds are longer-term debt instruments, where government of Kenya was going towards that. So in a way, I think this picture confirms to us that, yes, it might not be moving as fast as we'd like at the Institute of Economic Affairs, but at least the direction is the right one. And part of resolving Kenya's medium-term and even longer debt problem is actually to stretch the tenure of debt, because debts have to be paid. The government of Kenya is hamstrung by the revenues not growing as fast as expenditure is going. So one of the ways to cover that, obviously, is 2 ways. One, to lengthen the debt, but also for the government of Kenya to reduce the immediate and more medium-term deficit through fiscal consolidation. It concludes with the staff views on Kenya's debt sustainability, and the risk of external debt distress for Kenya is very high. It's high. Overall risk of debt distress is high, therefore. So Kenya is not out of the woods yet. So this structural transformation is incomplete, even if this picture tells us not. Granularity in risk rating is sustainable, because obviously Kenya is also widening. So whether it was looking at other sources, I think it is clear that the experiment with sovereign debt, especially those related to commercial debt, has not been a kind one for Kenya. I think it vindicates those who are concerned about the Eurobonds and all that, in addition to the transparency questions around them. So it's very, very clear that right now, the longer-term path for Kenya is obviously towards more concessional, but also long-term debts, but multilateral debts more specifically. And then, of course, the application of judgment is no, but it's suggesting that, yes, there's no crisis yet in Kenya's case, even though at the Institute of Economic Affairs, we're still concerned with external debt distress and the question of our debt. My colleague mentioned something that I need to put a spin on, that domestic debt is less risky. Not necessarily. So domestic risk, I think what she meant is that domestic debt is under government control to a large extent, in as much as we have an independent central bank. But sometimes domestic debt is easier in relative terms to manage if governments, one, could print money or roll over that debt. In many cases, the possibility of a rollover can be taken up, and therefore just pay the interest component of it. But domestic debt in Kenya also has one risky factor in the sense that its interest rates tend to be higher. So while there's no foreign exchange risk, but the interest rates on domestic debt in Kenya usually at 7-8%, sometimes a little bit higher. So yes, if you compare foreign and domestic debt, obviously domestic debt has is more under government control, but also domestic debt has other macroeconomic effects which might be destabilizing. Because if government responds to pressures on the budget through domestic debt, then obviously it displaces private sector borrowing, which is which can have other deleterious effects on the economy, on employment over time, and even government revenues. So, ladies and gentlemen, sorry for that summary. I know we've spent time, well, we have another 20 minutes or so, well, half an hour or so, but I'd like to hear whether any of us has any questions. So if you have any questions, please post them. There's a chat box here, you can send the questions, but I mean, since there are a good number of us here, we'd be glad to allow you to, if you raise your hand, I'll point to you, or I'll call out your name, and then we can have the questions answered by my colleagues, Maureen and Anna Grace, who I think have done a good job. So please let me see your hands. So just switch on your camera and your microphone, and you can ask the question directly to any one of them. Any answers? Any questions? Oh, really? I can't see any. Anyone with questions? Any question that's related to this subject, our sources, and what we think, or any of the findings in there? My colleagues would be glad to give you an answer. All right. Okay, let me just look at, if you look at page 10 of the presentation, I think my colleagues, so here in page 10, we're talking about the scope of the debt sustainability analysis, and my colleagues have split it into the 8 chapters. It's on slide 10. I think we made an error and we need to correct it. Yes. So basically, point 8 is not about the authorities' views in terms of the scores. Point 8 is basically the staff views, because that's where they make judgment about the debt sustainability itself. Because the debt sustainability analysis is actually an external analysis of the debt. So we apologize for that, but that will be corrected. All right. Any questions? Okay, we still don't have any questions. Because we don't, then I'll have my colleagues, Maureen. I'll start with Anna Grace and Maureen. You can each make your concluding points, and then we'll close if we still don't have a question by the time we are closing. So let me start with Anna Grace. Any concluding points?
I'd like to say that, first of all, thanks for joining us on this call. I think the report was very comprehensive. It's difficult to sum it up in a couple of slides, but I'd like to encourage people to go through it and just get a gist of, where Kenya is in terms of its debt distress, and even just looking at the fund. How is the IMF tracking, or rather keeping Kenya on its toes to make sure it meets its debt obligations to the IMF, and in whole just reframing the government. This structural transformation, structural reforms, I think they're going to come in big. We saw recently in the newspaper, there was stories about KQ receiving huge funds, and I hope it actually delivers. Maybe now it will, because the IMF is watching, but please read the report. It's very comprehensive and it's easy to read. Yeah.
Right, Mo?
Thank you, everyone. Just to add to what Anna has said, looking at the milestones Kenya is making, given the first report that came out in April, we've seen like major changes, say in KPLC, we've seen the PPA, the Presidential Task Force report that came out, the bailing out of KQ, among other changes that are going on in KPLC. I'll encourage you guys to keep on looking at the milestones that have been made. Yeah. And looking at our website for any new insights. Thank you.
Right. Okay, thanks. I have 2 points. One of them is that it's true, as my colleague said, if you go through the report, it's fairly easy to read. I think, well, let me say it's very it's lucidly written, so it's very easy to read, and I think it generates quite an interesting set of facts about Kenya's economy. Some of the data that is presented and the analysis that is tied to it is very good, high quality, if we might admit that. The second point is that while the staff views on slide 16 talk about the risk of debt distress and overall risk, I think one of the things that you tie that picture to is, in my view, or our view at the Institute of Economic Affairs, is Kenya is not doing enough yet to actually stretch the tenure of debt. 7 years is, I mean, in our view, medium term. I think to stretch that tenure of debt substantially in order to allow for the debt distress to be cleared is something that we need to be more clear about. And my view is that should be one of the major policy goals of any administration, whether one that's followed by whoever is in charge now. But the option for expanding or to buy space, fiscal space in Kenya, does not exist outside extending the debt, because the amount of debt that Kenya owes is quite substantial. Given that some of the figures that the IMF cites, or that are cited in this paper, of course, because of its cooperation with the authorities, suggests, in our view, an understatement of all debt in Kenya. If you look at obligations, whether they're recorded as debt, but also other obligations recorded as money that's due. If you consider, for instance, the fuel subsidy, which is being given right now back because of government trying to keep fuel costs within our cost. I think obligations are piling up related to that payment in the billions of shillings. And looking at the fact that yesterday international oil prices were heading towards $90, that pressure is going to continue. And with the fiscal stress that government of Kenya is in, sooner than later something is going to give, and the obligation will suddenly be revealed. So it suggests to me that the public finance management infrastructure in Kenya needs to be much clearer. So for instance, while the tax expenditures report was issued, I think one of the things that will also come up here is that even the subsidies that are hidden and whatever their costs are should be part of regular government of Kenya reporting, because only then do we know what the macroeconomic position is. So on behalf of the Institute of Economic Affairs, we are very thankful for you taking your morning to sit here together with us and to go through a small synthesis of what the content of the report. The report we are highlighting for the rest of the IMF program in Kenya, 38 months, we hope to be tracking Kenya's performance across those benchmarks. Because yes, at the Institute of Economic Affairs, we're not just interested in the borrowing component, but it's one of the things that the experience of borrowing under the Jubilee administration has told us, is that it has other macroeconomic and effects that trail all the way from farms into households. The effects are clear. So tracking the debt picture in Kenya has gone beyond what the debt numbers are to what its effects are. So the structural transformation that these two facilities engender would be significant, because they are actually suggest whether the economy is being repaired or whether this borrowing has simply just added to the pile up. So that's one. I've seen a question from, is it Eugene? And the question is, would it be viable idea to allow countries to borrow external debt, especially for development in the context of spurring local development in the counties? Counties to borrow external. Well, I don't think there's a barrier right now for counties to develop, to borrow, except that the constitution requires Kenyan counties that borrow to have that underwritten, or rather, to have that guaranteed by the Treasury, which means, of course, the government of Kenya. So if it's borrowed externally, obviously it adds to the portfolio of public debt. We think that's the right way to measure it, because those risks eventually are actually national risks. So yes, it doesn't stop them. But the conditions would be very stringent, and if you understand both the challenges and weaknesses that counties suffer, it will be quite a while before anybody has the confidence to lend to them. So it would be by inference, just basically the national government borrowing and then on lending to the county governments now. So yes, Eugene, it is possible, but the constraint, especially the structural constraints that exist, still show that it would obviously not. It would, just add the risks, of course, and the management questions that come with it. But yes, it is not. It's allowable according to Kenya's laws, with the condition that the Treasury would be guaranteeing that debt. So it's part of the sovereign debt. So, ladies and gentlemen, seeing that there are no more questions, I'd like to thank my colleagues, Anna Grace and Maureen, who prepared this presentation. As I said, every so often, whenever these reports come up, or even in the interim periods, tracking specific questions in public debt, and especially the structural reform side of it, we'll follow those, and we hope that you'll find these conversations increasingly interesting. We'll send you this presentation will be available right after this, and obviously before the end of the day, the recording of this conversation will be made available for those who'd like to study it more keenly or to use it to review the entire presentation. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much and have a good morning. From farms into households. The effects are clear. So tracking the debt picture in Kenya has gone beyond what the debt numbers are to what its effects are. So the structural transformation that these two facilities engender would be significant because they are actually suggest whether the economy is being repaired or whether this borrowing has simply just added to the pile up. So that's one. I've seen a question from, is it Eugene? And the question is, would it be viable idea to allow countries to borrow external debt, especially for development in the context of spurring local development in the counties? Counties to borrow external. Well, I don't think there's a barrier right now for counties to develop, to borrow, except that the constitution requires Kenyan counties that borrow to have that underwritten, or rather, to have that guaranteed by the Treasury, which means, of course, the government of Kenya. So if it's borrowed externally, obviously it adds to the portfolio of public debt. We think that's the right way to measure it because those risks eventually are actually national risks. So yes, it doesn't stop them. But the conditions would be very stringent, and if you understand both the challenges and weaknesses that counties suffer, it will be quite a while before anybody has the confidence to lend to them. So it would be by inference, just basically the national government borrowing and then on lending to the county governments now. So yes, Eugene, it is possible, but the constraint, especially the structural constraints that exist, still show that it would obviously not. It would, just add the risks, of course, and there are the management questions that come with it. But yes, it is not. It's allowable according to Kenya's laws, with the condition that the Treasury would be guaranteeing that debt. So it's part of the sovereign debt. So, ladies and gentlemen, seeing that there are no more questions, I'd like to thank my colleagues, Anna Grace and Maureen, who prepared this presentation. As I said, every so often, whenever these reports come up, or even in the interim periods, tracking specific questions in public debt, and especially the structural reform side of it, we'll follow those, and we hope that you'll find these conversations increasingly interesting. We'll send you this presentation will be available right after this, and obviously before the end of the day, the recording of this conversation will be made available for those who'd like to study it more keenly or to use it to review the entire presentation. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much and have a good morning.